was some hope around some agreement that could restore the mana of the English version to go alongside the mana of Te Reo Māori version as well.
There's little doubt that missionaries are implicated, and the church has to defend the role of its missionaries in the signing of the treaty. They had no desire beyond that to interfere with the operation of Māori government and law.
But in reality, you don't need a treaty to take a moral approach to living together. It should be inherent in our humanity that we do that.
You can't fault the treaty itself. It's actually our betrayal of the intentions of the treaty that is at fault.
You're asking then, I guess, about the translation.
One of the most significant moments in the history of Aotearoa New Zealand happened right here on the 6th of February 1840, the initial signing of the Treaty of Waitangi between local Māori and representatives of the British government. But any high school history student can tell you that. Something else that is being taught in schools and universities is that there were actually two treaties, a Māori version and an English version, and that they had very different meanings. There's a view that there was a purposeful mistranslation of the English text designed to trick or deceive Māori into signing away their sovereignty, and that the Christian missionaries were at the heart of this deception. But is any of that actually true? In this series, we've looked at the consequences of colonisation, the motivations of missionaries, and the transformational change that Christianity had on Māori society. In this episode, we focus on the Treaty of Waitangi. We'll be hearing once again from a range of experts, both Māori and Pākehā, and looking at the intention and purpose of the treaty. And we'll explore the role that Christians played in drafting, translating, and promoting it. And we'll also tackle some of those tricky translation issues. What did it mean to those involved back in 1840? Did they actually know what they were signing? And ultimately, what does it all mean for all of us today and for tomorrow? So what's the Treaty of Waitangi all about then? Today, people have varied interpretations of the motivations and intentions of those who originally drafted and promoted the treaty. Some believe it was designed to trick the Māori rangatira into giving up their land and sovereignty, and also to expand the colonial empire. But was this the original purpose? Is this actually what the missionaries and agents of the British government had in mind?
Britain intervened reluctantly in New Zealand in 1839. It intervened because it felt a responsibility to protect Māori from lawless British subjects. So the purpose was to establish government over British subjects for the protection of Māori.
The treaty itself comes out of a series of conversations about how do we protect Indigenous rights, while also accepting the fact that the globalising world is happening. Europeans are arriving in Aotearoa, and not all of those are acting with goodwill or good intent, or or treating Māori well. In 1839, there is a recognition that some form of larger scale colonisation by Europeans, by British settlers, is going to happen, and that's seen by missionaries and their humanitarian allies in London as a very bad idea.
We can distinguish between the intent of the people who drafted the treaty and rangatira who engaged in the debates, and of course we have some very rich records about that. Now, of course, within the empire there was a long tradition of signing treaties that functioned as tools that enabled the extension of British interests. Yeah. The East India Company expanded its reach through India through treaty making, for example. But there is no doubt that I think the intent of the drafters of Te Treaty or Waitangi here in New Zealand's aspirations were quite different from those of the East India Company.
By 1840, there'd been a change of government. There was some desire to placate the New Zealand Company, and there's been recent studies which show that New Zealand Company officials back in London were rather critical to a fragile government majority. Sounds very familiar, doesn't it? And so there were good reasons also to ensure, as the preface says, that a great company of British people were coming on many canoes, and they would need to be provided with safety and security.
Hobson was sent to New Zealand to achieve sovereignty if he could, if Maori wanted to cede it, and also a monopoly right on purchase of Maori land. Yep. And part of the reason for that was concern about the scale of pre-treaty European land purchases from Maori and the impact on Maori society. And preemption, Crown preemption, was looked upon as a way of being able to protect Maori from losing their land, and also about being able to control where Europeans were settled, to keep them in these small coastal enclaves focused on those extractive industries, and to keep them apart from Maori who would continue to govern themselves.
We have hugely detailed accounts of the intentions of the Colonial Office, of people like Hobson, key players like the Williams family and other agents, Anderson Coates of the Church Missionary Society, all of their intentions, and they say it in private journals and private letters and public documents, even in speeches in Parliament, their intention is to protect Māori rights and land, but also to restrain, to create enough sovereign power to restrain European lawlessness and to protect Māori from other aspects of the globalising world.
It seems clear then that the original intentions of the British government was for the treaty to protect Māori interests from the negative impact of colonisation. This is the direct opposite of some views which see the treaty as a treacherous tool that made colonisation possible by taking away the mana and rights of Māori for the benefit of British settlers. But what is the role of the missionaries in all of this? How essential were they in the drafting and promotion of the treaty? And what did they hope it would actually achieve? And what about the tricky translation issues? Did Henry Williams purposefully mistranslate the treaty in order to deceive Māori?
The treaty wouldn't have happened in the same way without the relationships that were established between missionaries such as Henry Williams and Māori. So Williams became the translator of the treaty. In a sense, missionaries had the relationships and they were trusted. So if the people that brought this new God, which you'd embraced, were saying this also is a good thing, or protect your rights and your interests, then you know that's a pretty clear explanation for why Māori signed.
Ancestors trusted the missionaries. They trusted Henry. The treaty was going to be for Māori a way in which they would be protected.
Henry Williams, who drafted the text, he spoke about it as a covenant, knowing that the rangatira he was wanting to sign the agreement and understood that concept. They were all terribly familiar with biblical language and biblical ideas. And they understood, and Williams emphasised, that covenant meant it was a special kind of relationship and an enduring relationship.
It's not a religious document, and although covenant language has been applied to it and was applied by some of those who signed it at the time, not all took that approach. And we have the interesting participation of the Bishop Pompallier, the Catholic bishop, who, while he wasn't a natural supporter of the treaty, as long as he was assured that all religions would be protected under this treaty.
The intent behind and the language of the treaty itself, with what we know about what Williams and the Williams family, their intent was what we know they are working with allies in the colonial office and so forth to protect Māori, and the treaty language that gets written down is entirely consistent with that intent. It's worth noting, of course, that it happens very quickly and in a very constrained period of time with just a small number of people in the room. So in that sense, it's always an imperfect historical document, but there is certainly no intent to deceive or to misrepresent or to do, I think, anything other than extend British sovereignty in a way that also accounts for the protection, for the preservation of Māori rights and land.
Look, I've heard so many different versions of what people think was the intention of Henry Williams. As I've gotten to know more about him over time and seen his heart and see the relationships that he tried to have, I can't believe that he deliberately sought to rip Māori off. I just can't believe that. Why invest all your time in people and then seek to undercut them through trickery? So I don't believe that, no.
Now, lots of us have suggested that that's an unfair interpretation, but we now have a massive book by Ned Fletcher in which he looks at the idea that there were two treaties, and this idea which is passed into folklore, really, and people come to accept completely confidently that Māori were hoodwinked and deceived. And then the law changes, and the law has placed a great deal of emphasis upon the Māori treaty and had some consequences in the way in which government is conducted. But what Ned Fletcher has shown is that actually, semantically, there are not two treaties. Of course, there's a limit in the word range that's available in order to express the treaty and the complexities of English law into Māori, who have quite a different notion about land and ownership.
And even just the English text in context, and you understand the people involved and the motive that they brought to bear, that in fact that you can see that the two texts reconcile quite well. Because the purpose was to establish government over British subjects for the protection of Māori. And as a result, all Britain was attempting to do was to obtain the power to do that. What they looked to do was to achieve a sovereignty which allowed them control of matters of foreign relations and trade and matters of justice, peace and good order, which were flashpoints in New Zealand in the 1830s. They had no desire beyond that to interfere with the operation of Māori government and law.
It's one, because I believe Williams was an honest guy. Two, he believed that Crown intervention was necessary in order to provide some control of British settlement, land speculation, land loss. And so he believed that that was a good thing, necessary in the end, to provide some framework for law and order, as we might say, or civil order, civil society, so that Māori would retain their chieftainships, their hapu communities and their hapu lands.
They've been given a very unfair rap, particularly Henry Williams, that if it's correct that on the British side they were comfortable with Māori retaining their own internal independence, then rangatiratanga was exactly the right word to express that. I think what's happened is that there's been the distorting effect of the later history, that what wasn't anticipated in 1840 was that hundreds of thousands of settlers would arrive. The scale of immigration that came about in the 1850s and 1860s, which were products of those decades, just couldn't have been envisaged.
What is clear is that missionaries here could see the value of the treaty that would protect Māori. In fact, for me, but for the treaty, we might be in a very dire situation today, and in fact, even from 1840, because the issue was around the nature of good relationships and also of justice and of fairness.
It certainly looks like there was not a purposeful mistranslation of the treaty, and there seems to be strong evidence that Henry Williams' translation was in fact accurate. This is very different from the popular view that there are two treaties with two distinct meanings. Some feel that as Māori mostly signed the Te Reo version to Treaty of Waitangi, the English version is worthless and open to attack. We seem to have two very different understandings of the intentions of the treaty based on the view that the two different translations have very different meanings. But the missionaries weren't the only bilingual people involved with the treaty. Many Māori had a strong command of English, and surely they would have been able to spot any translation inconsistencies if they in fact existed. So who's right on this one? Or is this also an issue of translation?
Henry's commentary here at Waitangi and at Waimate, Mangun and Kaitaia, would have assisted the thinking around it. So the thinking around it is that here is a document. It speaks of, uses covenantal language, uses language like kawanatanga, governance and so on. But also built upon the trust that they had in the missionaries, enabled, I believe, a deeper understanding at the time that that then was able to gain support, but also for those to put their name to it and to sign it. It's the foundation of the covenant that was agreed here, signed here at Waitangi and other parts of Aotearoa, New Zealand. It'll centre our thinking around how our nation was born. And I would say a Christian nation that insisted on fairness and justice, the tiriti provided for protection for Māori. No Māori person who signed the tiriti would have envisaged that their descendants would have been diminished in any way. I absolutely believe that it was there to enforce Māori place in society, well, in their communities.
There's a profoundly relational element, and we see that in the speeches recorded around the debates around Te Treaty. But I think it's also true that it's within the context of a Māori world that is changing, and actually, Māori becoming increasingly also aware of the contractual nature of colonial society. And of course, we see in the wake of Te Treaty in the 1840s and onwards, Māori leaders, Māori property owners also turning to the law to protect their interests. But absolutely, I think it's true to say that many Māori leaders who signed Te Treaty did so out of a concern with the nature of relationships between themselves and incoming Europeans, but also because of the nature of the relationships they had established with missionaries in particular, who were very important people who carried Te Treaty around the motu.
I think that relationships are probably some of the most complex things that we have to deal with as people. And so this is a highly complex relational agreement, and therefore it behoves us to prayerfully give our energies into being able to bring this into something of that will bring the fruit that was there in the hope in the beginning.
I think some people were more or less on the same page across chiefs, missionaries and Crown, but I think you need to do quite a lot of sort of interpretive analysis to sort of get to that point. Some areas never signed the treaty, of course, we should remember that. And other areas other than the North had limited access to Europeans and their ideas. So I think you can't say that everybody was on the same page.
There were a lot of European spectators hanging around the edge of the tent listening on, some of whom, of course, did think for their own interests that they didn't want this treaty signed because the last thing they wanted was British regulation. And of course, the real factors that drove the treaty, the signing of the treaty, was British concern that they'd be caught up into a war between Indigenous people and settlers, and this was the last thing they wanted. They had in some ways to appease the New Zealand Company, but one of the first things that they did was brought the flag over the New Zealand Company settlers.
By the looks of it, the treaty was more of a relational or spiritual document rather than being merely a legal or political one. Perhaps the real translation issue is the reinterpretation of missionary and colonial intention through a modern secular lens. Before we can decide what the treaty means for us today, we need to understand the perspective of those involved in the signing back in 1840. What were their intentions and understandings? And did they really understand the implications and consequences of signing? What were the hopes and aspirations for Māori, the Crown and missionaries for what the treaty would achieve? And regardless of various interpretations of past intentions, the question remains on what we do with the treaty now.
It's something we need to honour. We need to work together, to figure out what it means for now. Because in reality, we've evolved so much. Our political institutions have evolved so much from this sort of early imperial, situation. We now live in a liberal democratic state, multicultural society. But that doesn't mean that we forget those foundations, because they still obviously shape us and need to shape us, in my view.
I think it's a mistake to see it as a rule book. And sometimes that idea creeps into secular discourse when we have people use language like obligations, the Crown's failing to meet its obligations and so on. Well, we need to be able to define exactly what those are.
It's a reconciliatory document that's enabling two or more people groups to live together in harmony and to find ways to do that. It gives it creates a po. It's the skeleton, but we've got to put flesh on the bones, and it's a living document. So it's not set in stone in the sense that it just sits there. We need to give it life, and we need to breathe good life into it, and that's why understanding some of the deep issues of the treaty, they help to inform us. It's something that requires input and energy and vision and hope in order to give life to it and to sustain something good out of it.
More and more New Zealanders, and particularly government, has begun to understand its power as a foundation stone for social relationships on an enduring basis. Now, of course, many Māori who had signed Te Treaty of Waitangi had that view from the outset. Yeah. And if you look at the debates around Te Treaty of Waitangi, it's not just that the rangatira are debating the wording. What they're really debating is the nature of the relationships between, if you like, chiefly authority and the incoming Europeans. How is this going to work? And of course, once they signed, they did see it as a compact, often used the language of a sacred covenant. And of course, you can understand then very quickly why Māori leaders became concerned when angry, upset, when it became very clear that agents of the colonial state and various colonial commercial interests were very keen to see its provisions set aside.
I think our genuine partnership would be a mutual acceptance of the responsibility and obligation that we have to each other. Our mutual partnership would be one that is based upon equity, based upon surrendering oneself to each other in a way that brings out sincere bonds of affection between, in this case, between peoples or two or more peoples.
Well, biculturalism is a key just by the fact that we have two founding cultures. Yeah. With or without a treaty, we have two founding cultures. And in a decolonised country with two founding cultures, there has to be mutual respect.
Sovereignty is also an evolving concept, and in 1840 it was an absolute power that belonged to the Queen. In 2024, it's a political authority that belongs to everybody. All political authority comes from the people, and if you're to define sovereignty in those terms, then you need to ask which people. Just some people or all people?
There's little doubt that missionaries are implicated, and the church, especially Te Hahi Mihinare, the Anglican Church, has to defend the role of its missionaries in the signing of the treaty because, a great deal of their reputation hung on that, and in the subsequent failures, the willingness of Anglican missionaries and of Anglican Māori to stand up against a really pernicious approach by the government to seize land for settlers was very central.
We need to resist those voices that are determined to make Waitangi Day a place of disunity and conflict, because I think they're deliberately trying to attack that covenantal, that sacred covenant that I think has shaped New Zealand through the 20th century. And I think a renewal and a commitment to that, the vision of Waitangi and the treaty from the 1930s is something that will carry us through the next 100, 200 years.
Views on the Treaty of Waitangi, what it meant back in 1840 and what it means for us today and going forward, are some of the most divisive topics facing our nation. Can we have a grown-up conversation about this without resorting to name-calling and backing each other into ideological corners? We've seen that the Church played a key role in the establishment of the Treaty of Waitangi. What role, if any, does it have in engaging with the questions we now face? And what's the way forward for us as a nation as we look to the future with hope?
My hope sits in this, that at the signing of Te Tiriti o Waitangi were a whole lot of people who believed in God, and many would actually view the treaty as a covenant, right? And so there was this sense that it would have so much of a benefit for Māori people. Where that has not happened, that's an unfulfilled promise to me. And so I feel like today there's this onus on us to be able to have an understanding of what was intended. Yep, some missteps along the way, but that promise is still there for us to find a way to fulfill today.
The Church has some real culpability in terms of absenting itself from being the prophetic voice to sustain the intentions of the treaty. You can't fault the treaty itself. It's actually our betrayal of the intentions of the treaty that is at fault. So the treaty in itself, as many have called it, this covenant that was established in the land, is a wonderful relational document, human, fully human in one sense, and so also a flawed document in that way, but it's something that has extraordinary potential for us as a people to walk into and to try and work out.
The churches of New Zealand have always been very important social and political agents. They've engaged with a range of questions from the 1840s through to today, social questions, political questions, and cultural questions. And I think it's very, very important that church leaders, but church communities remain deeply engaged with these questions. And I think engage with both the word and the spirit of Te Tiriti o Waitangi.
We do have a role to play. We have a responsibility as God's children, in my opinion, to reconcile. And what does that look like? One example for me, anyway, in the Māori Anglican Church, the truth of what Māori have been speaking about in terms of land being taken by the church for gain and greed. That's correct in some cases, and so I can say under leadership such as our Bishop of Te Tai Tokerau, Bishop Te Ki Tohi Pikahu, on the 27th of November 2022, lands for the people of Peria in the northern area have been given by the church back into the hands of local iwi. Wow. And I think that is a powerful testament of reconciliation and our responsibility as a church to whakatika, to correct what has been wrong.
Knowing the story well, understanding the intent behind it, and then seeking creative ways now with all of the history that has passed, because of course we can't rewind clocks back to 1840 and try and do a reset, but going, okay, so now that all of this other stuff has happened, how do we try and take the same kind of gospel imperatives that were operating in the 1820s, 30s and 40s and bring those to bear today? What would that look like?
The way forward has to be something that's informed by what has happened in the past, particularly by what has not worked. So where we see power not being shared, relationships not being valued, resources not going to the right places, we know that that's not the strategy for the future. If co-governance is a scary term, it's because people haven't really thought about this notion that's within Te Tiriti of o Waitangi, which is about the thriving of all of our people. So whatever name you give it, It's really about what is the outcome, what are the fruits, what are the benefits for all of our people.
If you look at the genealogy of the treaty, you cannot extract the church from that conversation because they played such an important role in the formation and the ethos of the treaty leading up to it, in the translation of it, in the explanation of it, and in the defence of it. So it's a major role that the church has played in that, and I'm encouraging the church actually to take up that responsibility.
Despite their good intentions, Christian missionaries played a vital role in a series of events that led to the colonisation of New Zealand. However, this does not mean that the church was a co-conspirator to help the Crown subject Māori or trick them out of their land and sovereignty. In fact, we've seen some pretty strong evidence to the contrary. Given what we've learnt in this series, let's ask ourselves, how can the church come alongside those who have suffered injustice and betrayal? How do we work towards reconciliation and restoration? And what does the treaty mean for us today and in our future? Perhaps through genuine compassion and better understanding, and by building relationships of trust and service, we will see a spiritual transformation in our nation again. I certainly hope and pray that that is the case. Ka kite anō, mā te wā.